Thanks for coming. I've been saying in my stump speeches in this campaign, I want to be the next mayor of Syracuse, not its last mayor. And that's because we face a hostile takeover. If we go insolvent, we could have a state-imposed financial control board doing the budget for the city, which would be an austerity budget to pay our creditors first, and could even lead to the dissolution of the city into a countywide metropolitan government as proposed by the Consensus Commission. And if it's that kind of structure, it's going to be unfavorable terms for city residents. We have a $15 to $20 million recurring deficit out of a $300 million or so city operating budget. The property tax levy only brings in $34 million a year. And by the end of the current fiscal year, which is projected to run a $16.5 million deficit, we're only going to have about $20 million left in reserve funds, which means the next budget of the mayor may be that mayor's last budget. And then we're over the brink into insolvency. So I think the predicate to anything the next mayor does is to find revenue so the city doesn't go into insolvency. And to do that, I want to see a broader, fairer, more sustainable tax base. And I think that means income taxes from two sources. One is the state income tax and revenue sharing, and the other would be a graduated city income tax. And what that requires is political coalition building. I believe there's a powerful coalition among cities and towns, particularly upstate, ready to come together to get revenue sharing and home rule on income taxes. And I found this out when I was running for governor because I was pushing the revenue sharing, and it didn't become a big issue in the media, but I was getting calls from Republican town councilors, Democratic city councilors, legislators of both parties in the state legislature, and some public employee unions to say, keep talking about that. In fact, it got me on talk radio upstate on conservative channels more than it got me down in New York City on the liberal channels. And so that gives me hope that we can pull this coalition together. In the late 1970s, the state shared 8% of state revenues with municipalities. Today it's down to 0.5%. And that was cut over the decades to either cover state budget deficits or give high-end tax cuts to the wealthiest New Yorkers. And as a result, New York, 15% of our state programs are paid for by local sales and property taxes. That's off the charts compared to any other state. Most states are less than 1%. And that's why we have the highest property taxes in the country. There's been a shift from that progressive state income tax to local property taxes to pay for state programs. The least the state can do is pay for its unfunded mandates. And I think the next mayor needs to be at the forefront of a coalition to get that revenue sharing back up. The other thing we need is home rule, and that requires state act to enact a graduated city income. Yonkers has a city income tax, New York City does, and if we have a $2.8 billion payroll in the city, according to the U.S. Census in 2012, and that doesn't include the utilities. So it's about $3 billion. An average 1% tax would be $30 million a year. That would more than cover that structural deficit. And I would like to see it graduated. So you might pay zero tax on the first $25,000 of income, 0.5% on $25,000 to $50,000, 1% on $50,000 to $100,000, and 1.5% on over $100,000, something like that, so it averages to 1%. Either the revenue sharing or the city income tax would be enough to make us sustainable and solvent going forward. Now, a lot of people say, oh, if you impose an income tax, it's going to hurt business. That's nonsense. New York City is booming, and the income tax they have it's slightly graduated. It's just a little below 3% to up into the 3%. And it starts on your first dollar earned. It doesn't exempt low-income people. And the fact is, city services and infrastructure are the public avenues of private commerce. The real deterrent to business activity in this city is our highly concentrated poverty, which results in crime and struggling schools, and an infrastructure that's in disrepair. So you want to improve business conditions, you need the revenue to provide good services and infrastructure. Now, my opponents, I don't think, are being fiscally responsible in terms of dealing with a structural deficit. Juanita Perez-Williams says she grew up poor and she can make do on limited income. The problem is we don't want to be poor in the city of Syracuse in our public service and infrastructure any more than we want to be poor in our private incomes. And both Ben Walsh and Laura Levine say they have ways of increasing the property tax base. Ben says he was in economic development. Laura says she'll improve the schools. There's nothing wrong with those as long-term goals, but with a $34 million property tax intake and a $15 to $20 million deficit and only $20 million in reserves, we're not going to expand the property tax take by 50% in a year or two. That's just being unrealistic. And in a little debate we had that was broadcast Monday night, Ben Walsh added that we have public assets we could sell. Well, I don't know what those assets are, but they're one-shot revenues if you sell them. They could be used as, to lease or, as public enterprise. I'm not sure what assets he's talking about. That could generate income. But to just sell them off is basically to deplete the assets of the city for one-time revenues. And he also suggested that the water rates might be raised. Our water rates are high. That's a regressive tax. And I think we need to make the local tax more progressive. There are a number of things we could do besides these state revenue sharing and local income tax that would make our tax structure more progressive. I'll mention one. If the state passes single-payer health care, as I released last May, the city would save $80 million in health care costs between the city and the school budgets. That alone, again, would cover the deficit. But the point is, if we can get these progressive tax reforms, we can lower our high property taxes, which fall hardest on tenants and on homeowners with lower fixed incomes. So that's what I'm offering. I think that's what we need to do if we're going to not be taken over by a state finance control board. And I have a platform on my web page which goes into these things in more detail, and it has 85 topics that it covers, and people can find out more detail there. So, questions and answers?
You're the only one that's seemingly talking about this in such alarming terms. Why do you think no one else is kind of as far down the road in terms of urgency as you?
I think the top issues on the voters' minds are crime, schools, and economic development, job prospects, economic opportunity, and they're focused on talking about that. But I'm saying you can't do anything about any of those things if the city goes broke and the state is running us, and they're just going to impose more austerity, which will make the crime, the schools, and the economic prospects of the citizens worse. I'm not sure why they're not talking about it. I think, the numbers are clear. We're on the edge of insolvency. And I think the media is focused on it. We get questions in the forums from media on that. And I'm trying to get the voters. When I knock on a door, I want to be the next mayor, not the last mayor, because the city's going broke and I want to find the money so we don't. They said, I didn't know the city was going broke. What do you mean? And that starts a conversation. So you'll have to ask them why they don't want to focus on it. But I'll tell you, I think it's not responsible not to make that something you've got some answers for.
You're also proposing something that's so different from people's lives now, where the other candidates haven't quite gone as far as you. Are you worried you might turn off voters who think this just sounds way too different than what they're used to?
Well, if they look around the country, they'll see there are over nearly 5,000 local jurisdictions with local income taxes. And it's very conservative states: Kentucky, Indiana, Iowa, Kansas, Ohio, Pennsylvania. It's very extensive. Though, now we're getting in the Northeast, it's a little more liberal, but those, conservative Republican states do it. And that way they have lower property taxes and they have a fairer, broader, more progressive tax structure.
Some of the properties in Syracuse, there's a lot of properties that fall under, not necessarily a tax exempt, but basically they were deals struck where they're not paying what some people have mentioned as their fair share on property tax. So can you kind of bridge the gap between that? Like, if the city is making money off those properties, people still working at them, this is kind of, I'm assuming that's why you're coming at it from this direction, from income?
Yeah, the people making the high five-figure, low six-figure salaries mostly work on University Hill in downtown. And a lot of those properties are tax exempt. And they come in and they use city infrastructure like water and streets and services like the police, and they're not paying anything for it. Because of so many of our properties are exempt, and that includes the hospitals, the universities, 4 levels of government, And a lot of properties like the Destiny USA, they won't be paying property taxes till 2035. But a lot of people commute into the city to work at all those places. So we're asking them to pay a small tax to help support and contribute to the services that they're using and the infrastructure that they're using. And I think that's only fair. And the city is the economic engine of the region, so everybody in the region has an interest in the welfare of the city. So I think it's totally fair to have that kind of tax.
And I think we've all seen when we file our income tax at the end of the year, it asks specifically, did you work in Yonkers, or there's a few other that you've mentioned. So it's not a residency tax, it's, so these people could live in the suburbs, but if they're working and earning dollars in Syracuse, that's where this would come in, correct?
Yes, this is a tax on income earned in the city, whether you're a resident, a commuter, an absentee landlord, or whoever making money in the city. And it is like your state income tax where they ask you, did you make money in Yonkers or New York City? The administration of the tax is simple. You put it in the state income tax, and all the payroll and tax preparation software packages that are out there, they will put it in there, so it'll be automatic. And you know, the city for deductions can do it like they do the state and federal income tax. So it's not hard to administer. In fact, it's a lot easier than a property tax where you know, there's always arguments over what the market value is and what the assessment should be. So it's a much more straightforward and transparent tax system.
Isn't it harder to get this through because it's been mentioned since I've been in Syracuse for years, but it has to go through the legislative body to get approved. So how would you get that approved?
I think there's a powerful coalition of cities and towns waiting to be built. When I ran for governor, I had Republican town councilors, who were Republicans, and the big city Democratic councilors, as well as state legislators and public employee unions telling me, keep talking about that revenue sharing, because Syracuse is not the only city in fiscal distress. There are college towns like Delhi, or Delhi, I'm not sure they pronounce it over there in sort of over by Oneonta somewhere. And they have a state university, and they have more percentage of their property tax exempt than we do here in Syracuse. We're at about 50%. I think the town councilor I talked to there said they were at 70%. So I think we can pull these people together. In fact, I think we get the towns together, and then we'll have political cover for the Democratic mayors who may not want to stick their neck out and demand more revenue sharing from Cuomo on their own. So I think it's politically doable. And what I bring to the table is I've been an organizer in movements since the 1960s. I know how to put together coalitions. I could give you a whole list of things where we started out a small minority and became a majority and won the day. In fact, there are probably 10 or 12 issues where Cuomo was on the other side from me before he got elected, and now he's on my side. And I think we built coalitions like the ban on fracking and the $15 minimum wage, where he saw, I got nearly 200,000 votes, Sever Teachout got nearly 200,000 votes in the primary, and it woke him up. He wanted to know what these voters were thinking about, and it was these issues. So I think we just haven't put the coalition together, and that's one thing I think I can do.
Howie, can you talk about what some of the consequences have been for cities that have been put under state control or so-called emergency management?
Well, in New York, basically they appoint a board. It tends to be Wall Street types, and the first thing they want to do is make sure the creditors get paid, and they impose even more austerity. Syracuse cut its road repair budget in half this year. They could cut it in half again. They could tell us to lay off police officers. They could close more senior centers and fire stations, as we've already done. And then they could decide, and this is Cuomo's agenda, to consolidate city and county governments and town and county governments, that city's not viable on its own and you get merged into the county. And the way the Consensus Commission proposed it is we would be left a quote-unquote debt district with a quote-unquote overseer, making sure we paid extra taxes for our still segregated schools. They're not talking about consolidating schools. And for the pension and health care benefits of our former city employees. That would not be good for the residents of Syracuse. Around the country, you've had real disaster cases. I think of Detroit, Michigan, where they imposed an emergency manager and basically forced the city into bankruptcy. The city made some cuts in spending and were told you would get revenue sharing in return. And then the state reneged on that promise, and they imposed a emergency manager, which cut public employee pensions, and really devastated the public school system. We will lose control of our own local affairs, and that's probably the worst thing about it. I mean, if we do have to, struggle with limited resources, at least we ourselves should be deciding our priorities and not having some Wall Street guys in here telling us what we have to do. Now, the other thing about New York is there are two versions of Financial Control Board. One is where the board actually controls the budget, the other is where they advise. And currently under financial control are Buffalo, Erie County, Yonkers, and Nassau County. And Buffalo and Erie are now at the advisory stage. They were under control for many years. Yonkers and Nassau, I believe, are still under control. The other thing, which I think is a bad idea, is Cuomo, I think, correctly said you can't solve the local problems with these financial control boards. They're larger structural problems. Now, his answer is to just merge government, and supposedly that will reduce taxes. I think the numbers on that are about as realistic as Trump's alternative facts. As I said earlier, the reason we have high property taxes is there's been a shift from state income to local property taxes to pay for state programs. But he's right in saying it's a larger problem. What they did in Rockland County, which is also facing that, is they passed a law so they could issue bonds to cover deficits. And I don't know what Rockland County's income prospects are going forward, but I think it's a terrible idea unless you've got assured revenue coming and you just have to bridge the gap. So those are the things that have happened to other cities. And California, in New York tends not to let cities go bankrupt. California did. I'm trying to remember Pittsburgh, California, and San Bernardino. And they come out of bankruptcy, the creditors get paid, and the city is provides much more limited services, and infrastructure's left in disrepair. So it's not a good outcome.
Just so I can explain this to my viewers correctly, it would remove property taxes and instead just be a tax on people who make money in the city of Syracuse?
No, it would keep the property tax. I think you want a diversity of taxes and revenue sources, like if you're investing, you want a diversity of investments. Because in some years, you're in a recession, incomes will go down. The property valuation may go down, but it would go down more slowly. And sales taxes up and down with the economy. So you want all those taxes. What I want to do is get more progressive taxes based on state and local income taxes. And when we are able to cover the city's expenses with that, then we can lower the property tax and make the whole structure more progressive, more fair for everybody.
Are you worried that people aren't going to want to move here or work in the city if there's a new tax?
No, because the businesses, it doesn't come off their bottom line. It comes off the individual taxpayer. And the good jobs are in Syracuse, and they're not moving. They're government jobs, they're university jobs, they're hospital jobs. These are not enterprises that are going to move to Mexico or China for cheaper labor. They're going to be right here in Syracuse.
I wanted to ask a question about political parties. I was asking the other candidates how relevant they are anymore, and I bring that up because Juanita Perez-Williams didn't have a lot of the support from the Democratic leaders when they designated a candidate. One of the top contenders for mayor is Ben Walsh, who's an independent. So how important are political parties nowadays, and how does it feel? You've been running before, and you're in a party that's on the outside.
Well, I would say if you look at the changes Cuomo made, we have influence, and we have elected officials around the state, village mayors, town councilors, school board members, and hopefully this election will get people on a larger city, Syracuse City Council. We have 3 candidates and me for mayor. I think parties are important because they organize people around political perspectives and help them participate. What has happened is the Democratic and Republican parties, their grassroots are alienated. The Democratic Party touts itself as the party of the working person, but we've had 40 years of basically trickle-down economics that the Democrats join the Republicans in implementing. The Republicans say we're going to watch your money and be fiscally responsible. And under Reagan and under Bush George W., we had exploding deficits. So they're alienated. And that's why I think a lot of people are not listening to their political leaders in the old 2 major parties. And then political independence. I mean, Ben is saying he's not on the Democratic or Republican lines, therefore he's independent. Well, he actually sought both lines, and they said you have to enroll in our party. So you could say what he's doing is rebranding, given the circumstances. And being independent of the Democratic and Republican parties on the ballot on another line is one way of describing independent. The Green Party has another definition. We are independent of the moneyed special interests. We don't take money from corporations or for-profit entities because we want to represent the working people. And for us, it's that class independence that defines our political independence.
I have another off-topic question too. Center State CEO is going to propose that the Amazon headquarters comes to Central New York. Your thoughts on that?
Good luck. I mean, you look at the criteria Amazon put out there. One of them is fiber optic network. You know, Verizon said they built one. They built a little bit of one on the east side, the more affluent neighborhoods, and then said we're done. You know, I don't know what the mayor at that time was doing when he said come on in, but he didn't get much of an agreement because they walked away with no consequences. We don't have that. They want a cosmopolitan, tolerant community, and we're hyper-segregated. We have the highest concentration of Black and Latino poverty, the 5th highest concentration of white poverty in census tracts. And if you look on Syracuse.com and the anonymous consequences, you see a lot of racial dog whistles, if not outright racist statements. Those, you know, the people looking where to locate, look at that stuff. So we've got to take care of our social climate and our infrastructure before a company like Amazon is going to look at us seriously. You know, they did say that between Central New York and the Utica Rome area, we have low property values, which means it's inexpensive to live here, which is a selling point. We do have a few selling points, but if you go down the checklist that Amazon offered, we just don't qualify. So before we can get a company like Amazon coming here, we've got to, you know, get our infrastructure right, and we've got to basically deconcentrate the poverty, which means desegregate housing and schools, which is a long-term process. It took decades to concentrate the poverty, and it's going to take years to deconcentrate it. But if we're on the right path, then a company might look at us.
Isn't it a catch-22? In order for people to get out of poverty, you need jobs. In order for jobs, you need to bring businesses like Amazon or other businesses here so they can hire them.
I think we've got to rely on our own resources. We've got to develop our own businesses, particularly worker-owned businesses, employee-owned businesses, where the workers not only get a wage, they develop wealth in form of the assets of their share of the business. And Andres Duaney, the new urbanist city planner, has a statement. It's on my website. I won't quote it exactly, but he says, economic development in urban areas today requires smart government and lots of small investors. And I think that's what we've got to do. We've got to build up our local businesses, attract local markets. I'll give you one example. Syracuse University and the hospitals up on University Hill could do what they did in Cleveland around University Circle, which is Case Western and Cleveland Clinic in a surrounding low-income Black community. And what they did was provide long-term capital for worker co-ops that then served the eds and meds markets. And one of the co-ops was an industrial laundry. We could do that here. Coin Laundry shut down. We got a facility waiting to be reopened. It could be a worker co-op providing for the linens and other needs of the hospitals and university. They set up an urban farm in Cleveland that provided food, fresh produce for the food services at the university and hospitals. We could do that. They also set up a solar installation and manufacturing facility, which put solar panels initially on hospital and university buildings and built their business up so they're now serving the whole metropolitan region. That's the kind of economic development we know we can do and we're going to have to do. And if we do that well, then bigger companies are going to say, wow, Syracuse looks like a good place to do business. Let's see about locating there. But location decisions, the people make those decisions. They want to see what your labor force is, what your transportation is, what markets you're serving, how they relate to that location. And then they look at the civic amenities. How are the schools? How is the infrastructure? Does it have fiber optics and high-speed internet connections? How's the transportation? The last thing they look at is tax breaks. In fact, there's a book out by Greg Leroy that studied this and interviewed a lot of companies, and they said, yeah, we go for the tax breaks after we decided where we locate. And they like say, we want to locate in Syracuse, but we're going to tell Scranton and Youngstown we want tax breaks and we might locate there too. And then they get in a bidding war with Syracuse and get their taxes lowered on top of everything. We got to stop playing that game. Our economic incentives should go for developing our own people, not for luring established businesses that can pay their own way.
One last question. This 1%, 1.5%, whatever the person is applicable to your plan, it would come out of their paycheck just like a deduction, a weekly.
Right. And then when you fill out your tax form, you either get a refund or got to pay a little more. And it wouldn't be taxed on the very low income, be zero.
Right.
And then, you know, it'd be graduated.
That first tier would be above a basic.
Yeah, and we'll have to get some policy wonks and number crunchers and bean counters together to develop a structure that would generate an average of 1%. But, you know, as an illustration, I said maybe the first 25,000, you don't pay anything. All right, thank you.